The fire was small but steady. It pushed a circle of amber light against the earthen walls, catching the grain of the rough-hewn timber, throwing long shadows up toward the low ceiling of packed dirt and log. Outside, the wind was a living thing, a massive, indifferent animal pressing its full weight against the mountains, screaming through the pine canopy somewhere far above. But in this room that should not exist, the air was still. Warm. 58 degrees and climbing. Nora Caldwell sat on the edge of her cot, both hands wrapped around a tin cup of black coffee, and listened to the world try to kill her. It couldn't get in. She had made sure of that. The man on the floor was unconscious. He had been unconscious for the better part of 2 hours now, which was a mercy for him mostly, but also for her. While he was out, she didn't have to decide what to do about him. She could just sit here in the firelight and breathe. The Glock 19 sat on the plywood table to her left, within arm's reach, loaded safety off. His Glock. She had taken it from his pack while he slept the deep, dangerous sleep of a man whose body had shut itself down to survive. She looked at his face. Even slack and gray with fever, there was something hard in it. Something trained, the jaw too set, the brow too composed, even in unconsciousness. This was not a man who had gotten lost in a snowstorm. She had known that the moment she pulled the folder from his bag, but that part of the story came later. Everything came later. Right now, the fire needed another log, and the wind outside was reaching a register that made the earth above her head groan with a sound like a ship's hull under pressure. And Nora Caldwell, who had spent the last 38 days becoming someone the world could not touch, picked up the log, opened the cast-iron door of the stove, and fed the fire. Because that was what you did. You kept the fire going. Everything else could wait. 38 days earlier, she had been someone else entirely. The life she left behind had been the kind that looked from the outside like proof that the system worked. Nora had grown up in Billings, Montana, the daughter of a civil engineer who built highway overpasses and talked about load-bearing tolerances the way other fathers talked about baseball statistics. She had inherited his eye for the physical world, the way forces moved through structures, the way weight distributed itself, the way a thing could look solid and be secretly failing along a hidden seam. She had gone to the University of Washington on a partial scholarship, finished at the top of her structural engineering cohort, and spent the next 16 years building a reputation at a firm in Seattle that designed the kinds of buildings people photographed from the street. She lived in a glass-walled apartment overlooking Puget Sound. She drank good coffee. She ran 5 miles every Saturday along the waterfront and came back wind-burned and clear-headed and grateful for the particular quiet beauty of her life. She had been, by any reasonable measure, content. Gary Caldwell had seemed at the time like the natural completion of that life. He was a financial advisor 12 years her senior, with an easy laugh and a gift for making complicated things sound simple. They met at a fundraiser for a children's hospital. He had been charming without being aggressive, confident without being arrogant. They married after 18 months. She trusted him completely and without reservation, the way you trust the load-bearing wall at the center of a structure, the one everything else depends on. She had not known that wall was hollow. She had not known that for 3 years Gary Caldwell had been systematically looting the retirement accounts of nearly 800 working families who had invested their savings through Pinnacle and Cross Capital, the mid-sized Seattle investment firm where he worked as a senior advisor. He had done it carefully, surgically, using a network of shell companies with legitimate-sounding names, routing money through accounts in the Cayman Islands, and the Isle of Man, obscuring the transfers beneath layers of bureaucratic complexity designed to take federal investigators years to fully untangle. And he had used her name. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. Gary had forged Nora's signature on 47 separate incorporation documents, listed her as a co-beneficiary on 3 offshore accounts, and created a paper trail that made her look to any outside observer like an active and knowing participant in one of the largest retail investment fraud cases in the Pacific Northwest in 2 decades. The morning the FBI kicked her door in, Nora was drinking coffee and reading an engineering journal. She was in her bathrobe. She had a half-eaten piece of toast in her hand. Gary was already gone. He had left 4 days earlier, telling her he was traveling to Portland for a conference. His passport, his real passport, along with a second one she had never known existed, had crossed the border into Canada the previous afternoon. By the time the agents in their dark jackets were spreading documents across her kitchen table, Gary Caldwell was somewhere over the Atlantic. The next 6 months were a particular kind of hell that Nora had no engineering framework to understand. Her accounts were frozen within hours. The firm placed her on immediate administrative leave. The local news ran her photograph beside Gary's with a banner that read, "Couple sought in pension fraud." Her name appeared on the front page of the Seattle Times 3 times in 5 weeks. Colleagues she had worked beside for a decade stopped returning her calls. The attorney she hired drained the last of her accessible savings in 4 months. In the end, the evidence was clear enough. The signatures were forgeries. Forensic handwriting analysis confirmed it. The shell companies had been incorporated without her knowledge. Her digital footprint showed no access to the offshore accounts. The SEC investigator, a careful, methodical woman named Delaney, who Nora came to almost respect, cleared her of criminal liability after reviewing 14,000 pages of financial records. But cleared was not the same as restored. Cleared meant she wasn't going to prison. It did not mean she got her job back. It did not mean the newspapers printed a correction with the same prominence they had given the original accusation. It did not mean the 800 families who had lost their retirement savings stopped being angry or stopped needing someone tangible to direct that anger toward. By the time it was over, Nora Caldwell had $4,200 in a checking account. 2008 Subaru Outback with 140,000 miles on it and a name that had become in certain circles synonymous with the kind of betrayal that ruins lives. She drove east. She drove until the highway shrank to 2 lanes, until the 2 lanes became gravel, until the gravel became a logging road that her Subaru's suspension protested at every rut and washout. She drove until her phone showed no signal and the mountains filled the windshield completely enormous and indifferent and clean. 2 weeks before the FBI had come to her door, Gary had sent her something. She almost hadn't kept it. It came in a plain white envelope postmarked from a mail forwarding service in Reno, addressed in Gary's handwriting, that slightly left-leaning print she had spent a decade reading on grocery lists and birthday cards. Inside was a glossy postcard from something called Arboretum Wealth Management, the kind of promotional mailer that looked like it had been designed to advertise estate planning services to retirees. The front had a photograph of autumn leaves on a forest path. On the back, in Gary's hand, was a poem. 12 lines. Each one named a different tree or bird oak: cedar, the call of a nighthawk, the root of an alder. It rhymed badly and meant nothing she could pass. It felt like something a confused old man would write, not the calculating financial mind she had spent 3 years married to. She had almost thrown it away. Instead, she had tucked it into the back of her leather journal, the one she had kept since graduate school, because it was the last thing Gary had sent her, and she was not yet ready to decide what that meant. The journal went into the waterproof bin beneath her cot. The postcard went with it. She had no idea what she was carrying. In Boundary County, Montana, she found Eldon Sharp. He was 73 years old, lean as fence wire, with a face that had been weathered to the texture of old saddle leather by 6 decades of high-altitude winters. He ran a small outfitting operation out of a corrugated metal building on the edge of the national forest, and he owned, among other things, a parcel of land that appeared on the county assessor's map as approximately 5 acres of essentially useless slope on the eastern face of the Cabinet Range. She found his listing through a county land auction website, 3 sentences long with no photographs. Price, $3,000. Cash preferred. She drove out to meet him on a Tuesday in early September. The property was accessible by an overgrown logging road that her Subaru could barely navigate, the brush scraping both sides of the vehicle for the last quarter mile. When the road ended, she got out and looked at what $3,000 bought in Boundary County, Montana. It was a hillside. Roughly 45 degrees of incline, heavily timbered with lodgepole pine, the ground between the trees a mix of packed clay and shale that crunched underfoot. Somewhere below, through the trees, a gorge dropped away into blue shadow. The air was sharp and cold and smelled of resin and coming weather. Eldon Sharp stood beside her with his thumbs in his belt loops. "Can't build on it," he said, not unkindly. "Slope's too steep for any kind of foundation. Clay's going to move when the snowmelt comes. Whatever you put on top of this ground is going to end up at the bottom of that gorge come April." "I'm not going to build on top of it," Nora said. He looked at her sideways. She handed him $3,000 in cash, counted out in 50s. He took it without comment, and they signed the deed on the hood of his truck. As she was turning to leave, Eldon said, "First real snow hits end of November, usually. Gives you a couple months." Nora nodded and drove back down the logging road to begin the work of saving her own life. The plan had come to her somewhere outside of Spokane, driving east on I-90 with everything she owned in the back of the Subaru and no particular destination in mind. It had come the way her best engineering solutions always came, not as a sudden inspiration, but as a quiet, incremental logic. A problem taking shape. A set of constraints becoming slowly a set of possibilities. She could not afford to build a conventional structure. No concrete foundation, no lumber delivery, no contractor. She had no power tools beyond what she could carry, no heavy equipment, no help, but she was a structural engineer who had spent 16 years studying how forces move through materials. And the most fundamental lesson of structural engineering was this: you did not have to fight the forces. You could work with them. The earth was stable below the frost line. Ground temperature, once you dug past the first 4 feet, held at roughly 50 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round warm in winter, cool in summer. The slope itself, the thing that made the land unbuildable by conventional standards, became an asset if you changed your orientation. Instead of building on the hillside, you built into it. The earth became your walls. The mountain became your insulation. It was not a new idea. Pioneer settlers had built dugouts into hillsides across the Great Plains for exactly this reason. Nora simply intended to build one with the structural integrity of a modern load-bearing timber frame. She set up her canvas tent on the flat section at the top of the cleared logging trail and spent the first 2 days doing what she always did at the start of a project. She made a plan. She drew it in her engineering notebook with a mechanical pencil, cross-sectioned and dimensioned, calculating the load distribution of the earthen roof against the timber frame, the drainage angles to redirect groundwater away from the interior walls, the spacing of the log rafters to support the weight of 2 feet of compacted soil plus snow load. On September 8th, she drove 40 minutes to the nearest equipment rental operation, a cluttered yard run by a soft-spoken man named Dale Henner, who asked no questions and charged her $600 for 3 days with a battered mini-excavator. It was the largest single expenditure she could justify, and she made every hour count. For 3 days, she ran that machine with the focused intensity of a woman who understood exactly what she was doing and exactly how much time she had to do it. She carved a rectangular shelf into the hillside, 12 feet deep, 16 feet wide, a flat platform of compacted earth, with the hillside rising 10 feet straight up behind it. The geometry was precise. The angles of the cut walls were calculated to minimize the risk of collapse, while maximizing the interior volume. When the rental period ended and Dale came to collect the machine, Nora had the rough form of a room excavated into the mountain. She had also spent $600 she could not get back. What remained was everything else. The physical work that followed was the hardest thing Nora Caldwell had ever done in her life, and she had once worked a 22-hour continuous shift during a structural emergency when a downtown Seattle parking garage had shown signs of imminent failure during a storm. That had been exhausting in the way that professional extremity is exhausting the tiredness of the mind and the will. This was something different. This was the body. She felled lodgepole pines with a chainsaw. She had bought second-hand from a pawn shop in Sandpoint, selecting straight-grained trees of consistent diameter, limbing them on the ground, cutting them to length. She dragged them down the slope to the excavation site using a come-along winch she had rigged between trees, moving each log by increments of inches. She cut mortise and tenon joints by hand with a mallet and chisel. The same joinery technique used in timber frame construction for 4 centuries, because she had no way to drive mechanical fasteners into green wood with sufficient holding strength. The blisters came first, then the calluses beneath the blisters. Her hands became something she barely recognized, thick-palmed, rough, the knuckles cracked and stained with bark tannin that no amount of washing removed. She lost weight she hadn't planned to lose. Her shoulders and forearms developed a ropey, functional musculature that had nothing to do with the gym and everything to do with necessity. Every night, she collapsed onto her sleeping bag in the tent and lay absolutely still for a moment, cataloging the damage. The muscles in her lower back in particular protested with a persistence that alarmed her. She had no one to ask. She had no phone signal, no internet, no doctor. She kept a first aid manual in the waterproof bin and read it by headlamp when she couldn't sleep. She kept working. The timber frame went up over the course of 12 days. 8 vertical posts, each one 8 inches in diameter, mortised into a sill plate that she had notched directly into the compacted earth floor. Horizontal girts connecting them with diagonal bracing at each corner. A ridge beam running the length of the structure supported by 2 massive central posts. She lined the earthen back wall and side walls with heavy-duty pond liner, the same material used to waterproof stock ponds to redirect groundwater around rather than through the structure. Against the liner, she stacked horizontal log courses, one on top of another, creating a solid wooden interior face. By September 28th, she had a 3-sided wooden box embedded in the mountain. The front face was framed but open, waiting for a wall, a door, and a window. The sky above the cabinet range had begun its slow transformation, the brilliant, high-altitude blue of early September giving way to something lower, grayer, more considered. The aspen on the north-facing slopes had gone yellow almost overnight. The evenings came earlier and colder. The birds had changed. The jays were gone. The finches had thinned out. The mountain was making preparations. Nora noted all of it and worked faster. The roof was the critical element. She understood this in the way that structural engineers understand critical elements, not as an abstraction, but as a physical reality with specific tolerances and failure modes. The roof of a dugout structure bears not just the weight of the roofing material itself, but the full weight of the earth piled on top of it, plus the dynamic load of accumulated snow, plus any surcharge from saturated soil during spring melt. Undersize the rafters, and the whole thing could come down while she slept. She oversized them deliberately. The Douglas fir logs she selected for rafters were 12 inches in diameter, at the butt end, longer than she strictly needed, spaced more closely than a conservative calculation required. Across them she nailed thick pine planks edge to edge, covering the entire surface. Over the planks went 2 overlapping layers of the same pond liner she had used on the walls, lapped and sealed at the seams with waterproof tape she had driven 3 hours to procure from a specialty supplier outside of Missoula. Then came the work she would remember longest. For 3 days at the beginning of October, Nora shoveled the excavated dirt and clay back onto the roof. The material she had displaced with the excavator now had to go back up 1 shovelful at a time in layers, each layer tamped down with a hand tamper before the next was added. 2 feet of compacted earth blended at the edges with the surrounding hillside until from 20 feet away, the structure was simply invisible. A slight change in the slope. A low mound of clay and pine duff indistinguishable from the terrain around it. She had put the mountain back. By the time she finished, her lower back was a sustained note of pain that had moved beyond discomfort into something she was deliberately not labeling. She could still function, that was all that mattered. She had ibuprofen in the medical kit and a hot water bottle she filled from a pot on the camp stove each night and pressed against her spine while she lay on the cot. And this was what recovery looked like. On the afternoon of October the 4th, Nora was mixing a small batch of quick-set mortar for the hearth of her cast-iron wood stove when she noticed the air change. It was not a dramatic change. It was not a sudden darkening of the sky or a crack of thunder. It was subtler than that, a shift in pressure so rapid and complete that she felt it in her ears, first a faint equalization like descending quickly in an elevator. She looked up at the framing of the unfinished front wall. The clouds were not just low. They were organized, moving with a purposeful dark heaviness that she associated with serious weather systems. A wind came up the gorge from the south, carrying the unmistakable minerality of ice. Nora set down her mixing bucket. She had been planning to complete the front wall over the following week. She had 3 days of good weather before any meaningful precipitation, according to the last forecast she had pulled 3 days ago in Sandpoint. The farmer's almanac she had bought at a gas station outside Bonner's Ferry had predicted first significant snowfall in late November. She now understood that both of those predictions were wrong. What followed was 3 days of compressed, concentrated urgency that stripped away everything non-essential. She was not cold. She was not tired, not in any way that registered as a reason to stop. She was a woman with a problem that had a solution, and she needed to execute that solution before time ran out. The front wall went up in a day and a half. Vertical planks, face nailed to the framing gaps, chinked with a mixture of clay-dried pine needles and cattail fluff she had collected from a marshy area a quarter-mile down the logging road. It would not win any architectural awards. It would stop wind. That was enough. The door was a solid core exterior door she had pulled from a salvage yard in Sandpoint 6 weeks earlier, anticipating this exact need. She hung it on heavy iron strap hinges she had forged herself from bar stock using a wood stove and a ball-peen hammer, a process that had taken most of one afternoon and produced results that were crude but functional. Around the doorframe she nailed heavy canvas overlapping it at the corners, creating a draft barrier that her calculations suggested would reduce heat loss through the threshold by roughly 60%. She installed the wood stove on the afternoon of October the 7th, setting the cast-iron firebox on its brick hearth, threading the 6-inch stovepipe through the roof via a pre-cut penetration she had wrapped in a double layer of sheet metal flashing. She had not had time to test the drawer. She would find out whether the chimney worked when she lit the first fire. On the evening of October 8th, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours. The rain started at midday, a cold driving rain that turned the clay apron around the dugout's entrance into a surface like wet soap. By 2 in the afternoon it was sleet. By 4 it was heavy wet snow, the large flaked variety that accumulates fast and pulls down pine branches. By 6 o'clock, the world outside the dugout door had become a roaring white confusion, the kind of blizzard that closes mountain passes and kills livestock left out in it. Nora was inside. She sealed the door, pressing the canvas tight against the frame. She pulled a handful of dry cedar bark from the kindling box she had filled 2 days earlier and built a small teepee of tinder in the firebox. She struck a match. The cedar caught immediately a small, bright flame that climbed the bark and reached the dry pine kindling above it. She added 2 split pieces of lodgepole, not too large, not too fast. She needed the fire to establish itself to heat the flue pipe enough to create draft. She watched the joint where the pipe met the firebox, watched for back puff for the smoke that would mean the drawer was wrong and she would have to go out in the blizzard to adjust the roof flashing in the dark. The smoke went up. Clean, straight up the pipe, and she heard it, the faint, beautiful whisper of air moving through the firebox, the sound of a chimney that was working exactly as designed. She sat on the edge of her cot and allowed herself 30 seconds of something that was not quite relief, because relief implied she had been afraid, and she was not sure she had been afraid exactly. She had been calculating and moving. Fear was a thing for people who had time to feel it. What happened next was the closest thing to a miracle that Nora Caldwell's engineering mind would permit her to call it. The outside temperature that night fell to 12 degrees below zero. She checked it twice with 2 separate thermometers she had purchased for exactly this purpose because she didn't trust the reading the first time. 12 below. A temperature that exposed skin freezes in 11 minutes. A temperature that kills car batteries and cracks water pipes and sends deer to their lowest possible shelter and convinces the mountain that it has, for another year, won. Inside the dugout by 2 o'clock in the morning, the temperature was 64 degrees. Not because the stove was working particularly hard. The stove was the ignition. The mass was the engine. 2 feet of compacted earth on the roof, 10 feet of solid hillside at the back log walls on 3 sides, all of it had spent the last month absorbing the warmth of September and early October, storing it in the slow, patient way that thermal mass stores heat. Now it was releasing that warmth back into the small room at a rate that was almost exactly calibrated to offset the heat lost through the front wall and the door. She had designed it correctly. She stripped off her outer layers, the mud-caked canvas jacket, the soaked wool overshirt, and hung them on the pegs she had driven into the timber frame beside the door. She put water on the stove for coffee. She opened a can of tomato soup and set it beside the pot to warm. She sat on her cot in the amber light of the kerosene lantern and listened to the blizzard try to get in. It couldn't. For 2 days, she stayed in the dugout. The storm did not abate. If anything, it intensified on the second day, the wind shifting to the northwest and driving snow against the front wall with a force that she could feel as a faint rhythmic pressure against the wood. She read. She slept waking to add wood to the stove every 3 or 4 hours. She cooked soup and oatmeal and instant rice, ate slowly and without pleasure because she was rationing carefully and every calorie mattered. She did not think about Gary. She made a deliberate practice of not thinking about Gary the same way she made a deliberate practice of not thinking about the apartment. She would never go back to the career she had been building for 16 years, the colleagues who had stopped answering her calls. Those things were outside. They were in the world of before. In here, in the firelight, there was only the stove and the food and the wood and the problem of staying alive. It was in a way she had not expected enough. On the evening of October the 10th, the storm had been running for 48 hours and showed no sign of stopping. Nora had finished her second book, a dog-eared paperback history of the Lewis and Clark expedition she had bought at a gas station, and was considering going to sleep early when she heard something. It came from outside the door. Beneath the roar of the wind, beneath the deep structural groan of snow-laden pines bending to their limit, there was something rhythmic, something with intention, a sound that the storm was not making. She heard it 3 times before she placed it, a fist striking wood. Slow, deliberate, weakening. Thump, thump, thump. Nora set down her cup. She did not move for a moment. Her mind ran through the possibilities with the same methodical speed she applied to any engineering problem. Bears were denning. Mountain lions didn't knock. A human being in a blizzard on a logging road that didn't appear on most maps at the top of a slope that even experienced backcountry hikers would struggle to navigate in good weather. The knocking stopped. There was a sound instead that she recognized after a moment as something dragging against wood. A body. Losing the fight with gravity, then barely audible over the wind, a voice. Male. Low. The single word stripped of everything but urgency. Help! Nora was off the cot before she had consciously decided to move. She had the shotgun in her hands, the 12-gauge she had purchased for exactly this contingency for the bears and the mountain lions and the 1,000 things the wilderness could send against a lone woman at the end of an unmapped road. She racked a slug into the chamber. The metallic sound was loud and final in the small room. She stepped to the door. Who's there? Her voice was steady. She had not spoken aloud in 2 days, and the sound of it surprised her, slightly rougher than she remembered. A long pause. The wind filled it, then, please. The voice was fading at the edges. I'm bleeding out. Nora's hand rested on the door bar. Her mind was doing what her mind always did, running the variables, mapping the decision tree. Open the door. You let in the cold, you compromise the shelter, you introduce an unknown into a controlled environment. Don't open the door. A man dies against your threshold in a blizzard. She lifted the bar. She opened the door 3 inches. The wind hit her face like a slap cold, an absolute extinguishing the lantern instantly and sending the stove flames sideways. Snow drove through the gap in a diagonal sheet. She could see nothing but white dark. Then the door pushed inward, not with force, with weight, the slow leaning weight of a body that had nothing left. She stepped back automatically and the door swung wider, and something large and completely limp folded across her threshold, catching the doorframe on the way down, pulling it all the way open. Nora grabbed the collar of a frozen parka and pulled. She dragged the body over the threshold with both hands, stumbling backward into the room. She kicked the door shut and dropped to her knees. The lantern was out. The stove still threw light, a thin, wavering orange that was enough to see by if she was close enough. She pulled herself to the cot, grabbed her headlamp, strapped it on. She turned it on and looked at what the mountain had delivered to her. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, dressed in high-end technical gear, an Arc'teryx parka, Gore-Tex hiking pants, serious mountaineering boots. All of it was crusted with ice. His face was slack pale to the color of old candle wax. His lips the deep blue-gray of severe hypothermia, but it was his right leg that took the full beam of her headlamp and held it. The fabric of the hiking pants had been torn, not cut, but torn as if by enormous force, from mid-thigh to just above the knee. Through the shredded Gore-Tex and the dark, half-frozen mass of congealed blood, she could see the shape of the wound beneath. The wrong shape. The angle that no leg should make. Nora Caldwell had spent 16 years as a structural engineer. She understood exactly what it meant when a load-bearing element failed catastrophically and came apart at the point of greatest stress. She understood the physics of it, the material science of it, the consequence of it. She had never seen it in a human being before. She slapped his face once hard. "Hey, look at me. What's your name?" His eyes moved, rolled, found her with obvious effort as if focusing required something he was running out of. "Garrett," he said. His voice was a wreck. "Garrett Voss. What happened to your leg?" A pause. His jaw was shaking so hard she could hear it. "Avalanche." The word came out in pieces. "Ridge. Slid off the ridge." Nora was already on her feet, moving to the trauma kit, the heavy red bag she had packed herself. Item by item from a list she had spent 3 evenings compiling in this same firelight. She had thought when she packed it that she was preparing for a chainsaw accident. She had not imagined this. She pulled the trauma kit open. She had 4 things she needed to do, and she needed to do them in exactly the right order, and she needed to start in the next 90 seconds. Her hands were already moving. Outside, the blizzard pressed against the mountain with everything it had. Inside, the fire burned steady and low, and Nora Caldwell went to work. The tourniquet went on at 8:14 in the evening. Nora noted the time by reflex, the same way she had always noted the start time of a critical operation. Whether that operation was a stress test on a load-bearing column or an emergency repair on a failing retaining wall. Time was data. Time was the one variable that kept moving regardless of what you did or didn't do, and if you lost track of it, it would kill you just as surely as anything else. She had 2 hours, maybe slightly less. After 2 hours, with a tourniquet cutting off circulation to a limb, the tissue damage became irreversible. The clock had been running since the moment she cinched the nylon windlass high on Garrett Voss's right thigh and cranked the plastic rod until the bleeding slowed to a seep. That had been the easy part, relatively speaking. The hard part was everything that came after. She cut away the ruined hiking pants with trauma shears, working quickly and without sentiment about the expensive fabric. The wound beneath was worse than she had prepared herself for, and she had prepared herself for something bad. The femur, the strongest bone in the human body, a structural member capable of bearing 4 times a person's body weight under normal loading conditions, had fractured at mid-shaft with enough violence to drive a 2-inch section of the bone itself through the overlying muscle and skin. It was protruding, white and stark and absolutely wrong, catching the beam of her headlamp with a clarity that made her stomach clench once hard and then settle. She did not have time to be nauseated. She filed the reaction away and returned to the problem. The problem was mechanical. She understood mechanical problems. A compound fracture of the femur created a specific failure cascade. The large muscle groups of the thigh, the quadriceps in front, the hamstrings behind, were among the most powerful in the body. When the bone broke, those muscles went into violent, sustained contraction, pulling the broken ends past each other, overriding the architecture of the skeleton. The bone fragment that was now outside the body was being held there not by the injury itself, but by the ongoing muscular force that the nervous system in its panicked state could not stop generating. The only way to get the bone back under the skin was to overcome that muscular force with a greater opposing force applied along the exact axis of the femur, pulling the distal fragment, the lower portion of the broken bone, back into alignment. Manual traction. field reduction of a long bone fracture. She had read about this in the wilderness medicine manual she had bought and read cover to cover in late September, sitting in her tent by headlamp while the first cold nights settled over the mountain. She had read it the way she read everything carefully, technically, with the part of her mind that was always translating language into physics. At the time, she had hoped it would remain theoretical knowledge. She looked at the central post. It was a 10-inch diameter lodgepole pine set plumb and square in the compacted earth floor, rising to the ridge beam 8 feet above. She had selected it for exactly this structural role, the primary compression member of the entire frame, the element that carried the load of the roof at mid-span. It was not going anywhere. She grabbed a length of static climbing rope from the gear wall, the orange and black kern mantle line she had used during construction to rig the come-along system for moving logs. She shook out a working length of about 15 feet. From her kit, she pulled a locking carabiner. Garrett had drifted back into semi-consciousness. His eyes were half open, tracking nothing. His breathing was shallow and rapid, the respiration of a body in circulatory shock, working hard to compensate for blood loss and cold and pain. She needed him present for this. She needed him to hold still. She slapped his face again twice, with enough force to bring him back. His eyes focused on her with an expression she could not quite read in the dim firelight, something between anger and desperation and the particular vulnerability of a large, strong man who had no options left. "Garrett." She held his gaze. "I'm going to reduce the fracture. That means I'm going to pull your leg straight until the bone goes back inside. I need you to understand what's happening, and I need you to stay as still as you can. The rope is going to do most of the work. Your job is to not move." He stared at her. "Do you understand?" "Yeah." The word was barely there. "Do it." She tied the rope around his ankle with a clove hitch, cinching it over the top of his mountaineering boot, which she left on deliberately. The rigid sole would distribute the traction force across the ankle joint, rather than concentrating it on soft tissue. She ran the free end of the rope around the base of the central post, then back to her hands, using the post as a redirect to create a mechanical advantage system. Not a true pulley, the friction coefficient was too variable, but enough to multiply her pulling force by a factor that her body weight alone could not generate. She poured isopropyl alcohol over the exposed bone and surrounding wound bed. Garrett's reaction was immediate and violent. His back arched off the floor, both hands slamming flat against the dirt. A sound came out of him that she had never heard a human being make before. Not quite a scream. Something lower and more fundamental than a scream, something that belonged to a register below language. His whole body went rigid. "Stay still," Nora said. Her voice was not gentle. Gentleness was not what this moment required. 3 seconds of that and it's done. Stay still. She braced both feet flat against the dirt floor, took the rope in both hands, and threw her full body weight backward. The rope went taut with a sound like a struck guitar string. The carabiner clicked hard against the post. She felt the resistance immediately enormous. Elastic resistance, the accumulated force of 3 large muscle groups, all pulling in the same direction. She leaned back further, loading her legs using her body weight as the counterforce. The rope groaned. The post did not move. She pulled harder. Something gave, not all at once, but incrementally, the way a structural element moves before it fails, small and then faster. She felt Garrett's leg lengthen against the rope, the muscles stretching under the applied load, and then the sound was wet and definitive. A deep, dense pop like a joint being cracked underwater, amplified by the close walls of the dugout and the absolute silence that had fallen over Garrett in the instant before it happened. Nora held the tension. She looked at the wound. The bone was gone. Not gone inside, where it belonged. The protrusion had disappeared as the broken ends slid back into alignment under the sustained mechanical load. The wound bed was still open and devastating, a deep, irregular cavity in the muscle tissue, seeping dark blood in a slow, controlled bleed that told her the tourniquet was doing its job and the femoral artery for the moment was intact. She tied off the rope to hold the traction. Then she moved. She worked fast now with the focused economy of motion that comes only from knowing exactly what you're doing and exactly how much time you have. She flushed the wound with the remaining isopropyl alcohol and then with a full bottle of sterile saline, forcing the fluid into the wound cavity with a large irrigation syringe from the trauma kit. She packed the cavity with hemostatic gauze, pressing it in with gloved fingers, filling the dead space. She wrapped the entire thigh in compression bandaging 3 overlapping layers of 4-inch elastic gauze tight enough to matter. For the splint, she used 2 lengths of 2x4 lumber she had cut as forming boards for the hearth construction, straight dry, still smelling faintly of the sawmill. She padded them with strips torn from a fleece blanket. One board ran along the outer aspect of the leg from hip to heel. One ran along the inner aspect from groin to heel. She bound them in place with duct tape, working from ankle to hip in overlapping spirals, immobilizing the fracture site completely. Then she released the tourniquet. She watched the bandaging, held her breath. A small red bloom appeared at mid-thigh, soaking into the compression layer. She watched it for 30 seconds. It did not spread. It did not spread. The femoral artery was intact. Nora sat back on her heels and looked at the clock. 9:47 p.m., 93 minutes from tourniquet application to release. She had 11 minutes to spare. She became aware in the way that you become aware of things only after the immediate crisis has passed that her hands were shaking, not from cold. The dugout was 62 degrees and climbing. From something else, from the accumulated physiological cost of 93 minutes of sustained maximum output focus. She pressed both palms flat against her thighs and breathed until the shaking stopped. Garrett was unconscious. The pain had taken him under somewhere around the moment of reduction, his nervous system making the merciful calculation that consciousness was no longer a useful state. His color was still bad, the grayish pallor of significant blood loss, but his breathing had deepened and steadied. She covered him with 2 wool blankets, tucking them around the splinted leg with care. She put more wood in the stove. Then she looked at the backpack. It was a large tactical pack, not a hiking pack, not a mountaineering pack, but the kind of pack that people who needed to carry serious equipment in difficult terrain chose deliberately. Matte black, heavy-duty webbing, Molly attachment points on the outside. It was propped against the wall beside the door where she had pushed it when she dragged Garrett over the threshold. It was still crusted with partially melted snow. She had saved his life. That much was settled. What was not settled was who he was and what he was doing on an unmapped logging road at the top of a private hillside in the middle of a freak October blizzard. Nobody hiked this terrain in mid-October. Nobody hiked this terrain at all by choice this far off any established trail system. She had chosen this location precisely because it was the kind of place where nobody came. Somebody had come. She crossed the room, unclipped the heavy polymer buckles of the pack, and pulled the main compartment open. There was no camp stove. There were no freeze-dried meals. There was no tent, no sleeping bag, no bear canister. There was none of the equipment that a person who had come to these mountains for any legitimate recreational purpose would be carrying. What she found instead, laid out with the methodical organization of someone accustomed to working from a kit, was this: a matte-finished satellite phone with a cracked screen currently showing a dead battery icon. A pair of Swarovski binoculars, the kind that cost as much as a decent used car. A spare 15-round magazine for a Glock 19 fully loaded. A black Pelican hard case with foam-padded interior latched and locked. And sealed in a clear waterproof bag, a manila folder approximately an inch thick. Nora took the folder. She brought it to the plywood table near the stove, where the lantern she had relit after closing the door threw a steady yellow circle of light. She peeled open the waterproof bag and laid the folder flat. She opened it. The first page was a photograph, 8 by 10, printed on glossy stock, the kind of image quality that came from a serious telephoto lens. It took her a moment to recognize the subject because the angle was odd, slightly elevated, taken from across a parking lot. But the subject was identifiable. The Subaru Outback with the cracked rear bumper. The woman loading 60-pound bags of quick-set cement into the rear cargo area, her hair pulled back. Her face turned 3/4 toward the camera. That had been 3 months ago. She remembered that day the hardware store in Sandpoint, the way the cement bags had been stacked awkwardly on the pallet, the teenager who had offered to help her load them, and looked relieved when she declined. She turned the page. A photocopy of the property deed she had signed with Eldon Sharp. Her handwriting, her name, the parcel number, and the legal description of the 5 acres of Cabinet Range Hillside she had paid $3,000 cash to own. She turned the page again. Bank statements. Her bank statements from the account she had opened in Kalispell under her legal name because she had needed an account, and she had not been hiding exactly. She had simply been hoping that the people who wanted to find her had better things to do. They had not. The next page was a printed document. Clean sans-serif typeface, a title at the top. Target assessment. Nora Caldwell Maiden. Name, Hinsley Dobb. March 14th, 1983. Status unconfirmed location / flight risk. Believed possessor of offshore routing credentials. Operational directive, locate and extract account access. Information authorized. Leverage extreme. Client Pinnacle Recovery. Coalition. Nora read it twice. She set it down on the table and pressed both hands flat against the plywood and breathed. The Pinnacle Recovery Coalition. She knew the name. She had heard it mentioned twice during the federal investigation, a consortium of institutional creditors and private investors who had lost money in Gary's scheme and had formed a legal entity to pursue asset recovery through channels that the SEC and DOJ were moving too slowly to provide. Legal in theory. In practice, the kind of organization that hired the kind of people who ended up on unmapped hillsides in the dark with tactical backpacks and spare magazines. She looked at Garrett Voss on the floor. He was still. His chest rose and fell with the slow, deliberate cadence of someone the body has decided to put in a protected state. The splintered leg was elevated on the rolled sleeping bag she had placed under his ankle. She had just spent 93 minutes keeping this man alive. She looked back at the folder. The next several pages were deep background material. A reconstruction of her movements over the past 4 months assembled from a combination of surveillance photography, financial records, and what appeared to be interviews with people who had interacted with her along the route. Dale Henner's equipment rental receipt was there. A note about the pawn shop in Sandpoint where she had bought the chainsaw. A gas station receipt from Bonner's Ferry obtained God knows how. Someone had been following her trail for months. You shouldn't have opened that. The voice came from the floor and it hit her like cold water. She spun around. Garrett Voss was awake. He was propped on one elbow, the blankets half fallen from his shoulders, his face sheened with fever sweat and gray with the effort of holding himself upright. But his eyes were clear. Whatever drugs his nervous system had used to pull him under were wearing off, and what was looking at her now was not the desperate hypothermic wreck she had dragged over her threshold. It was something considerably more alert than that. Nora stepped back from the table. Her eyes moved to the Pelican case across the room, the case she had not yet opened. "Who are you?" she said. Her voice was level. She was working to keep it level. Garrett studied her face for a moment. The particular stillness of a man who has been trained to read situations and is doing exactly that. "I think you already know," he said. His voice was rough, damaged by cold and pain, but the steadiness underneath it was deliberate, professional. Pinnacle Recovery Coalition. The clients, not me. Then who are you? He lowered himself carefully back to the floor, the motion precise and controlled, despite everything his body was currently dealing with. Contracted investigator, asset recovery specialist. A pause. Among other things, you were following me for 3 months. Tracking your movements, yes. The fire snapped. Outside, the storm pressed against the mountain with undiminished fury, and for a moment that was the only sound in the room. "The people who hired you," Nora said, "think I have access to the offshore accounts. They think you know where the money went. Different thing. I was cleared. The SEC cleared me. The FBI cleared me. My name is not on those accounts. Your forged signature is on the incorporation documents for 3 shell companies that received a combined total of $18 million from Pinnacle and Cross between 2019 and 2022. My forged signature. Gary forged it. That was established as fact by forensic document examination. Forensic document examination can be challenged. Nora looked at him. The anger that moved through her in that moment was cold rather than hot. The kind of anger that sharpens rather than clouds, that makes the mind faster rather than slower. She was intimately familiar with it. She had been living inside it for the better part of a year. I have $4,000 left, she said. I built this house with a mattock and a used chainsaw. I am eating canned soup and rationing ibuprofen. Do I look like someone sitting on $40 million? Garrett held her gaze. Something moved behind his eyes, not quite doubt, but the precursor to it. The first fracture in a load-bearing assumption. People hide things in unusual ways, he said, but his voice had lost a degree of certainty. I'm not hiding anything. I came here because this was the only place I could afford, and because I needed to be somewhere the noise couldn't reach me. She sat down on the edge of her cot across the room from him, the plywood table and the open folder between them. The noise being people exactly like you. The silence stretched. Garrett's jaw was working slightly. She recognized it as the involuntary movement of someone fighting back a wave of pain using the pressure of clenched teeth as a counterweight. His fever was climbing. She could see it in the growing flush across his cheekbones, the particular brightness in his eyes that was not alertness, but temperature. Gary is dead, Garrett said. The words landed in the room and stayed there. Nora did not move. She processed the sentence the way she processed structural failures, looking for the crack. The load path, the place where it changed everything downstream. When, she said. One word. 3 weeks ago. He was in Costa Rica, a beach town near Jaco, staying at a boutique hotel under a different name. A cartel affiliate found him. We think he had tried to negotiate access to the funds in exchange for protection. He couldn't deliver. Garrett paused. They found him in his room. The fire crackled. The wind outside shifted register, dropping half a tone, then climbing back. Gary was dead. Nora sat with that information for a moment, turning it over, looking at it from different angles. The way you looked at a structural drawing, not for what it was, but for what it implied. What it changed, what it meant for the loads that were currently being carried by everything else. She felt no grief. She had spent 8 months grieving, but what she had grieved was not Gary. It was the version of Gary she had believed existed. That version had never been real. The real Gary had used her name as a tool and walked out a door and never looked back. And 3 weeks ago he had died in a hotel room in Central America, because even the criminal network he had run to couldn't protect him from his own choices. What she felt instead was a cold, clarifying focus. The money, she said. Garrett nodded one shallow motion. He moved it before he ran. The Cayman accounts were emptied and closed 2 days before his passport crossed into Canada. He converted everything into cryptocurrency and transferred it to a cold storage wallet, a hardware device completely offline, not accessible through any network, not traceable by any blockchain analysis. And the wallet. We don't have it. We've turned over every property he had access to, every storage unit, every safety deposit box in 3 countries. It's not in any of them. He held her gaze. But Gary sent something before he left. Our analysts pulled his encrypted email archive, took 4 months to crack the encryption. In the 3 days before he disappeared, he sent 1 piece of outgoing mail, not to a numbered account, not to a lawyer. He stopped. Nora's hands went still in her lap. He sent it to you, Garrett said. The kerosene lantern threw its steady yellow light across the table, across the open folder, across the photograph of a woman loading cement bags into a Subaru in a parking lot 3 months ago, not knowing she was being watched, not knowing that the piece of junk mail she had tucked into the back of a leather journal, without fully understanding why, was the most valuable object within 500 miles. 12 lines. 12 types of trees and birds, badly rhyming. meaningless on its surface. A seed phrase for a cryptocurrency cold wallet was exactly 12 words long. The moment she made that connection, she understood that Garrett Voss could see it happen in her face. She watched him watching her, and she saw the precise instant when he knew that she had understood, because his expression changed, some last vestige of uncertainty dropping away, replaced by something that was not quite satisfaction but was close to it. "There's a device in my pack," Garrett said. His voice had changed again, moving from the reluctant candor of a man cornered by logic toward something more deliberately calibrated. The professional voice. The voice of an offer being made. "Tactical transponder. Encrypted frequency. I have a team in Kalispell, 4 men, a winterized Bell 4, 1-2 on standby. You activate the beacon, they're here in 40 minutes regardless of the weather." Nora did not look at the pack. "You give them the seed phrase," Garrett continued. "The wallet gets access, the funds get recovered. The Pinnacle Coalition recoups what it lost. The investors get made whole, and the government gets the rest. You walk away with $5 million and a new name, and nobody ever looks for you again. And you. I get airlifted out of a dugout in Montana with a leg that needs a surgical team, so I'd call that a reasonable outcome for everyone." Nora stood up. She crossed the room to the backpack. She reached past the satellite phone, past the spare magazine, past the Pelican case. She found the transponder at the bottom of the main compartment underneath a folded emergency bivvy. A device roughly the size and shape of a large television remote, matte black with a shielded antenna and a small alphanumeric keypad beneath a rubber weather flap. She turned it over in her hands. She had seen civilian personal locator beacons before. She had priced them out when planning this project, considered keeping one for genuine emergencies. The standard civilian units, the ACR Rescue Link series, the Spot devices, were unmistakable. They had NOAA branding. They had single-button deployment mechanisms. They were designed to be usable by panicked, hypothermic, half-conscious people who needed to summon government search and rescue without making any technical decisions. This device had no NOAA branding. It had a keypad. Keypads meant encrypted frequency selection. Civilian beacons did not need encrypted frequency selection because civilian beacons transmitted on one frequency, 406 MHz international, monitored by government satellites around the clock, automatically relayed to Coast Guard and FEMA coordination centers. A device that needed a keypad was a device that could transmit on frequencies that those government satellites were not monitoring. She looked at Garrett. "This doesn't call search and rescue," she said. His expression did not change in the way that a guilty person's expression would change. It changed in the way that a professional's expression changed when an operation reached the point where the cover story was no longer functional. A slight relaxation, almost like relief. "It calls my team," he confirmed. "And your team's objective is asset recovery, not rescue. The two aren't mutually exclusive. You said the authorized leverage was extreme." She held up the folder. "That's a direct quote from your own operational document. What does extreme leverage mean, Garrett, in practice? To a team of contractors landing in a blizzard at midnight on a private parcel with no legal authorization and no law enforcement oversight." He didn't answer. "I saved your life tonight," Nora said. The words were not an accusation. They were a statement of fact, offered the way she offered all facts plainly, without decoration. "I reduced a compound femur fracture in a dugout with rope and lumber and a trauma kit. I have been keeping you alive for the past 2 hours. And the thing you're asking me to do right now is activate a beacon that summons a team of armed contractors whose operational brief authorizes extreme leverage against me." She set the transponder on the table beside the folder. "I'm going to need you to understand why I'm not going to do that." Garrett looked at the ceiling. The rough-hewn logs above him, the packed earth between them, the entire improbable weight of the mountain resting on the frame she had built with her own hands. He was quiet for a long time. "The people who lost their retirement savings," he started. "I know who they are," Nora said. "I know what they lost. I know what Gary took from them. I spent 3 months being investigated for it and another 3 months watching the news coverage of it. and I have thought about those 800 families every single day since this started." She sat back down on the cot. Her voice was flat and exhausted and completely sincere. "I did not take their money. I cannot give back what I don't have. And I'm not going to hand a seed phrase worth $40 million to a private recovery team operating outside any legal framework in the dark in a blizzard, because there is no version of that scenario where those 800 families see a single dollar." Garrett closed his eyes. His fever was clearly spiking. The flush across his cheekbones had deepened to something that concerned her, and his breathing had acquired a faint wet quality at the top of each inhalation that she did not like. The early signature of infection beginning to declare itself in the chest. He needed a hospital. He needed a surgical team for the leg and IV antibiotics and imaging to assess what else the avalanche might have done to his internal architecture. He needed all of this within the next 48 hours, or the outcome became much less predictable. She needed the storm to break. She looked at the dead satellite phone sitting on the floor beside Garrett's pack. An iridium unit, she could tell by the form factor, the antenna design, the specific weatherproofing around the port covers. Iridium phones were the gold standard for remote communication because the Iridium constellation provided true global coverage without dependency on ground-based cell towers. A working Iridium phone in this location, even beneath 2 feet of earth and in the middle of a blizzard, had a reasonable chance of acquiring a satellite signal if she could get the antenna close enough to the door. The phone was dead because the battery was depleted. Garrett had been on the mountain for however long he had been on the mountain before the avalanche caught him, and he had not had a way to recharge. Nora looked at the marine battery sitting against the east wall. The deep cycle 12-volt unit she used to run her LED lighting charged daily by the small solar panel on the roof. The battery had been at full charge when the storm started, and her LED lights drew almost nothing. It still had capacity. The Iridium phone used a proprietary charging connector. She did not have an Iridium charging cable. What she had was a toolbox, a wire stripper, a voltage multimeter, and 16 years of applied engineering training. She looked from the phone to the battery, then she got up and went to the toolbox. Garrett watched her from the floor, saying nothing. Whatever calculation he was running behind those fever-bright eyes, he kept it to himself. She found the wire stripper. She found the multimeter. She found a voltage regulator module she had salvaged from a dead car battery charger in September. She had known planning this project that she would need to step battery voltage down safely for various devices. She cut the Iridium phone's proprietary charging cable at the transformer block. She stripped the cut ends, identified the positive and negative leads with the multimeter. She wired the voltage regulator into the circuit, setting the output to 5.2 volts, within the tolerance range of most lithium battery charging systems. She connected the regulator's input terminals to the marine battery with alligator clips, checked polarity twice, and plugged the stripped cable end into the phone's charging port. She waited. The screen remained dark for 11 seconds. Then the battery icon appeared, the flat red bar of a completely depleted cell beginning to register the first trickle of incoming charge. She set the phone down and carried it, trailing the wire to the marine battery across the room to the door. She pressed the antenna against the wood planks at the point where the door met the frame, the thinnest section of the front wall where the only barrier between the antenna and the open air was 3/4 of an inch of pine. She held it there. On the screen through the battery charging icon, a signal indicator flickered. 1 bar. Gone. 1 bar again, and this time it held. Nora did not call 911. She knew the number she needed because she had called it before, from a kitchen table in Seattle with a federal agent sitting across from her, walking her through what was about to happen to her life. The FBI field office in Missoula, Montana. Area code 406. She had not written the number down because she had not needed to. Numbers stayed with her the way structural dimensions stayed with her, precisely, permanently, without effort. She dialed. The call connected on the 3rd ring. She identified herself. She gave her GPS coordinates. She had recorded them when she first established the site, and she knew them in her sleep. She stated clearly that she had a medical emergency requiring federal medevac and that she was in possession of information material to an active federal asset recovery case involving the Pinnacle and Cross Capital fraud. Then she said the words she had been constructing in her mind for the past 20 minutes. I have the seed phrase to the cold wallet containing the Pinnacle and Cross funds. I will provide it to a United States attorney in exchange for a written immunity agreement confirmed in advance. I will not provide it under any other circumstances. I need a medevac helicopter, and I need a federal attorney on the line before the weather clears. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" The agent on the other end, a man with a flat Midwestern voice, asked her to repeat the last part. She repeated it. There was a pause. She could hear keyboard clicks. "Ma'am, we're going to need to verify your identity and location. Can you stay on the line?" "I can stay on the line," Nora said. "The man on my floor can't stay alive indefinitely, so I'd suggest moving quickly." She sat down with the phone pressed to her ear and her back against the door, and the fire burning in the cast-iron stove, and the mountain pressing down on all sides, and she listened to the federal government begin slowly to organize itself around the coordinates she had given it. Outside, the blizzard was exactly as absolute as it had been an hour ago. The wind had not changed, the snow had not stopped, but something had changed. Nora Caldwell had stopped running. The federal agent's name was Pruitt. He told her this twice in the careful way that people in official positions repeat their names when they want you to understand that a real human being is on the other end of the line, not a process, not a bureaucracy, but a person taking what you are saying seriously and writing it down. "Agent Pruitt." Nora set her back against the door, the phone pressed to her ear. "I need you to understand the timeline. The man on my floor has a compound femur fracture. He is febrile, and I am managing his infection with oral antibiotics from a field trauma kit. That is not a long-term solution. I need a medevac authorization, and I need a U.S. attorney contacted before this storm breaks, because the moment that weather clears, other people are going to be moving toward my location." "What other people, Ms. Caldwell?" "Contractors. Private asset recovery team operating for the Pinnacle Recovery Coalition. 4 men, a Bell 412 helicopter on standby in Kalispell. The man on my floor is their advance operative. They have been tracking my movements for 3 months. She looked at Garrett. His eyes were closed, his breathing audible from across the room, not labored exactly, but effortful in a way that had not been there 2 hours ago. "They do not know his current status. They will have a last known position from his transponder before he was injured. When the storm breaks and they don't hear from him, they will move." More keyboard clicks, a muffled conversation in the background. "Ms. Caldwell, I need to ask you directly. The seed phrase you referenced, you are in physical possession of this. I have a piece of correspondence that contains it, yes. Sent to me by Gary Caldwell before he fled the country. I did not know what it was when I received it. I know what it is now. And you're willing to surrender this to federal authorities. I am willing to surrender it to a United States attorney in exchange for a written immunity agreement that closes any remaining investigative interest in me related to the Pinnacle and Cross Capital case. Not a verbal assurance, not a promise over the phone, a document reviewed by an attorney of my choosing before I hand over anything." She kept her voice even. "I have been through this process before, Agent Pruitt. I understand how it works. I am not making unreasonable demands." Another pause, longer this time. "I'm going to need to make some calls," he said. "Can you stay on this line?" "I'll stay on as long as the battery holds. But get the medevac authorization moving now, regardless of anything else. The man on my floor did not make the choices that led him here, and he does not deserve to die of sepsis in a dugout in Montana while attorneys negotiate paperwork." She heard Pruitt relay something to someone else in the room. She heard the words medevac and cabinet range and compound fracture and the name Garrett Voss. She heard faintly the sound of a second phone being picked up. Then she settled in to wait. Garrett opened his eyes sometime around midnight. The fever had reached a plateau, the particular bright stillness that meant the body had committed fully to the inflammatory response and was now burning at that level, neither climbing nor falling. She had given him 2 more ibuprofen from the trauma kit, crushed and dissolved in water, and pressed a cold compress against the side of his neck. He looked at the phone in her hand. "You called them," he said. Not a question. "FBI field office in Missoula." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm had shifted register, the wind dropping from its peak ferocity to something more sustained and businesslike, settling in for the long haul. The snow had not stopped. She could hear it against the front wall, a constant sibilant pressure, the sound of accumulation. "The coalition's team," Garrett said. "When the weather breaks, they'll move." "I know. They have a last transponder ping from the ridge where I went down. They'll triangulate from there." "I know that too." He looked at the ceiling. "I should tell you the men they sent. They are not the kind of people who respond well to federal presence. When they see a government aircraft, then they'll make choices that result in federal charges," Nora said. "That's their problem, not mine." Garrett turned his head toward her. In the firelight, with the fever flush and the 3-day stubble and the exhaustion of a man who had been through something serious and was beginning to understand the full shape of it, he looked older than she had first estimated. Not old, but worn in a way that went deeper than the last 24 hours. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect? Someone hiding, someone scared." A pause. "Someone who needed to be found." Nora looked at the fire. "I was hiding. I was scared. Past tense." She fed another log into the stove, watching the flames adjust to the new fuel. "I came up here because I needed to be somewhere that the noise couldn't reach me. And it turned out that building something with your hands in the actual physical world, where the laws of physics apply and materials either hold or they don't, and there's no room for other people's narratives about who you are, it turns out that's a reasonable way to stop being scared." Garrett said nothing for a long moment. "Gary destroyed my life," Nora said. "Not the money, not the investigation. Gary, the person I thought I knew, the structure I thought I was living inside." She looked at the timber frame around her, the posts and beams and joinery she had cut and fitted, and raised herself the geometry she had calculated on paper and then executed in wood and earth. "So I built a different structure. One that I understood completely, one where I knew every joint and every load path and exactly what it would take to make it fail." She paused. It helped. The fire burned. The wind pressed against the mountain. "My brother," Garrett said after a silence that had gone on long enough to mean something. "He worked at Pinnacle and Cross for 11 years. Fund manager. Good at it. He believed in what he was doing, not just the money, but the clients. He knew their names. He knew some of them personally, retired teachers, a couple who had saved for 40 years. He stopped. His jaw worked. When it collapsed, he lost his job and his professional license, and most of his own savings, which he had invested through the firm, but what he couldn't recover from was the clients. Knowing that those people he had looked in the eye and told their money was safe, had lost everything. "I'm sorry," Nora said. She meant it without qualification. 2 months ago. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. "I know. You told me." She looked at him directly. "I'm sorry about your brother, Garrett. Genuinely. And I need you to hear me when I say this. I did not take their money. I did not know what Gary was doing. I have asked myself 1,000 times whether I should have seen it, whether there was something I missed, some sign I ignored, and I have never found a satisfying answer to that question. But I did not participate. And the best thing I can do for the people who lost their savings, the only thing I can do is make sure that $40 million goes back into the hands of a federal court that will distribute it correctly and not into the hands of a private recovery operation that will take its percentage first." Garrett looked at her for a long time. "The seed phrase," he said finally. "You're really going to hand it over?" "Every word of it." "To the FBI? To a U.S. attorney in exchange for a written agreement?" "Yes." He was quiet. Something was moving behind his eyes, not suspicion this time, not the calculating assessment of a professional measuring an asset. Something more like recalibration. A man updating his model of a situation based on new data that did not fit the model he had arrived with. "There were 812 accounts," he said. "I have the list. I've had the list for 4 months." He stopped. "Some of those people lost everything. Not a significant percentage of their savings. Everything." "I know." "Then you understand why I took this job." "I understand why you took it." I don't agree with how it was authorized to be conducted. She looked at him steadily. But I understand. Agent Pruitt came back on the line at 1:17 in the morning. The medevac authorization was in process, a Sikorsky UH-60 out of the Montana Air National Guard facility in Great Falls on standby, pending weather clearance with a trauma surgical team aboard. ETA after weather break, approximately 40 minutes. The U.S. Attorney's Office had been contacted. A federal prosecutor named Whitfield had been woken up and briefed. She was willing to have a preliminary conversation about the term, an immunity agreement. The preliminary terms, a complete closure of federal investigative interest in Nora Caldwell related to the Pinnacle and cross-capital fraud in exchange for full cooperation and surrender of the cold wallet seed phrase where Pruitt said carefully, not unreasonable from the government's perspective. Nora asked to speak with Whitfield directly. The call transferred. Whitfield was a woman in her 50s with a voice like a closing argument, precise, deliberate, leaving no room for misunderstanding. They spoke for 14 minutes. Nora asked 4 specific questions about the scope of the immunity provision. Whitfield answered 3 of them fully, and one with a qualification that Nora pushed back on, and Whitfield ultimately revised. When the call returned to Pruitt, Nora said, "Get the helicopter moving the moment the weather allows. I'll have what you need." She ended the call to preserve the battery. She went to the waterproof storage bin beneath her cot and lifted the lid. Inside, organized with the precision she applied to everything, were the personal items she had carried out of Seattle. A photograph of her father standing beside a highway overpass he had designed in 1987, squinting into the sun, one hand on the concrete abutment with a proprietary pride she had always loved. Her engineering notebook from graduate school, and the leather journal, its cover soft and dark with the oil of 12 years of handling. She opened the journal to the back. The postcard was there. Glossy front autumn leaves on a forest path. The Arboretum Wealth Management logo in tasteful serif type. She turned it over. Gary's handwriting, that slightly left-leaning print so familiar, it still produced a faint physiological response she refused to dignify with the word grief. 12 lines. She read them slowly for the first time with full attention, not as a confusing piece of correspondence from a man she was still trying to understand, but as what it actually was. 12 words, each one embedded in a line of verse like a key hidden in a sentence. She found them in sequence, marked each one with a light pencil dot. Oak, mariner, cobalt, wren, sable, threshold, 11, drift, pallor, vein, lantern, crossing. 12 words. The seed phrase for a cold storage cryptocurrency wallet containing, according to Garrett Voss, $40 million in converted assets belonging to 812 retired teachers and nurses and factory workers and small business owners who had trusted a man with an easy laugh and a gift for making complicated things sound simple. She read the 12 words twice. Then she got a Sharpie from the toolbox and wrote them on her left forearm in clear block letters, evenly spaced the way she would have written critical dimensions on a site drawing legibly permanently in a place where they would not be lost, regardless of what happened next. Then she put the postcard back in the journal back in the bin, and the bin back under the cot. She did not sleep. She added wood to the fire at regular intervals, monitoring the interior temperature, checking Garrett's vital signs, pulse respiratory rate, skin temperature at the neck and wrist. His fever peaked at around 3 in the morning, reaching a point that made her genuinely concerned, and then began a slow, grudging retreat towards something less alarming. By 5 in the morning, it had dropped to what she estimated was 101, still elevated, still dangerous, but no longer climbing. She kept the fire burning. She thought about the 812 accounts. She thought about her father and his highway overpasses and the way he had explained structural engineering to her when she was 9 years old, standing on a bridge above the Yellowstone River. Every load needs a path, he had said. You don't fight the force, you give it somewhere to go. The structure's job is to be the path. She had spent the last 38 days being the path for her own survival. Now she was going to be the path for something else. She was at peace with that in a way she had not anticipated. It was clean. It was the right geometry. Shortly before 7 in the morning on October the 15th, the wind changed. Not stopped, changed. The pitch dropped, the violence drained out of it, and what remained was something that still moved through the pines, but without conviction. The last exhalations of a system that had spent everything it had, and was now simply emptying out. Nora registered the shift before she was fully awake, pulling up from a shallow doze she hadn't intended to fall into her hand, finding the satellite phone by muscle memory before her eyes were open. 4% battery remaining. She looked at Garrett. He was awake, lying still, watching the ceiling with the careful, conserved attention of a man who understood that unnecessary movement was a cost he could not afford. "Wind's dropping," she said. "I hear it." She pressed herself upright from the cot, her back protesting the night on the thin mattress with a familiar located pain that she had learned to catalog and set aside. She added the last of the morning wood to the stove, watching the coals wake up around the new fuel. Put water on for coffee. Moved through the small space with the efficiency of someone who had learned its dimensions in the dark, who knew without looking where every surface was, where every tool lived. Garrett's eyes tracked her without moving his head. "You slept," he said. Not an accusation, closer to surprise. "Couple of hours. Your fever broke around 4. She checked his forehead with the back of her wrist, the field nurse's method imprecise but directionally accurate. Still warm, but the burning quality was gone. Whatever the infection was doing in his bloodstream, it had crested, and the body's defenses were now winning the argument. "How's the pain?" "Present." A pause. "Manageable." She gave him 2 ibuprofen dissolved in water, the last of the dose she'd been rationing through the night, and watched him swallow it. Then she picked up the satellite phone and dialed Pruitt's direct number. He answered on the first ring. "Weather's changing at my location," she said. "Wind is dropping, maybe 50% reduction in the last 30 minutes. Still some snow, but it's lightning." "Matching what we see on radar," Pruitt said. "The system is moving northeast faster than the models had it. We're looking at a viable launch window in the next 45 to 60 minutes. A pause. "Ms. Caldwell, I need to tell you something before we get into final logistics." Something in his tone made her still. "The Kalispell situation," Pruitt said carefully. "The private team, the coalition contractors. We had law enforcement eyes on the hangar through the night. About an hour ago they moved. They didn't wait for the weather window we were tracking. They lifted off in instrument conditions, and they are flying this direction." Nora looked at the clock on the wall. 6:58 a.m. She looked at the front door. She looked at the transponder sitting on the plywood table where she had left it the night before. "How long?" she said. "At Belfour 1-2 cruise speed from Kalispell, using the last known transponder ping for triangulation, we estimate they reach your area in 20 to 30 minutes. Our aircraft is 45 out minimum." The math was not complicated. There was a gap of 15 minutes, maybe more, during which 4 armed contractors with an operational brief authorizing extreme leverage would be on the ground at her location before any federal presence arrived. 15 minutes. She looked around the dugout. The Glock on the table, the shotgun leaning against the wall beside the door, Garrett on the floor in no condition to be moved. "Agent Pruitt," she said, "I'm going to need you to stay on the line." "Miss Caldwell, stay on the line." She set the phone on the table and crossed to Garrett. She dropped to one knee beside him, close enough that he didn't have to raise his voice. "Your team is coming," she said. "They're not waiting for the weather. 20 to 30 minutes. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, the quick involuntary calculation of a professional running scenarios. "How far out is the FBI bird?" 45 minutes minimum. He looked at the ceiling. She watched him do the same math she had done. "The men they sent," he said slowly. "Briggs runs the ground team. He stopped, started again. "He will not care that I'm injured. He will not care about federal jurisdiction or legal frameworks. He has a job, and he will do it. What does doing it look like? Garrett's jaw worked. It looks like whatever gets him the seed phrase in the next 10 minutes, and then it looks like a helicopter lifting off a Montana mountainside with no witnesses to what happened here. The fire snapped. Snow pressed against the door with a light, steady insistence that was nothing like the roaring fury of the previous 2 days. Nora stood up. She went to the plywood table. She picked up the tactical transponder, the matte black device with its keypad and its shielded antenna, and turned it over in her hands for the second time. Last night, she had identified it as a closed network device transmitting on encrypted frequencies that NOAA satellites did not monitor. She had been right about that, but she had been thinking about it in terms of what it was designed to do rather than in terms of what it was physically capable of doing. It was at its core a radio transmitter, a sophisticated one with selectable frequencies and encrypted protocols, but radio transmitters did not care about the intentions of the people who built them. They cared about physics. They transmitted on whatever frequency you told them to transmit on, and they did it at whatever power level the hardware supported. The standard civilian distress frequency was 406 megahertz. It was monitored continuously by the NOAA SARSAT constellation, a network of government satellites specifically designed to detect emergency beacon signals and relay their GPS coordinates to search and rescue coordination centers. The ACR Rescue Link beacons she had priced out months ago transmitted on exactly this frequency with exactly this purpose. She flipped open the rubber weather flap on the transponder and looked at the alphanumeric keypad. The device had selectable frequencies. That was why it had a keypad, which meant if the hardware's frequency range extended down to 406 megahertz, and if she could navigate the keypad's menu system to override the encrypted default, she could turn a mercenary's private communication device into a fully compliant civilian emergency beacon broadcasting her GPS coordinates on the internationally monitored distress frequency. Not just to the FBI aircraft, to every SARSAT ground station on the continent simultaneously. She sat down at the table with the transponder, the small LED work light she used for detailed tasks, and the focused attention she had once given to engineering problems that did not have obvious solutions. "What are you doing?" Garrett said from the floor. "Thinking." She turned the device over, examining the antenna connector, the port configuration, the seams of the housing. "How deep into the menu system does this thing go?" A pause. "What?" "The keypad. When you access the frequency settings, how many menu levels down is it?" Another pause longer. When Garrett spoke again, his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, something between wariness and a reluctant, almost involuntary curiosity. "Main menu, then. Transmission parameters, then frequency band. 3 levels. And the frequency band selection, is it a list or a manual entry?" "Manual entry. You type in the frequency in kilohertz. 406 megahertz was 406,000 kilohertz. Does the hardware support that range?" A longer silence. She could hear him thinking, could almost hear him deciding something about whether to answer. When he spoke, his voice was flat and deliberate. "The RF module is a broadband unit. It supports 150 to 950 megahertz. He paused. "You're going to reprogram my transponder to broadcast on the SARSAT frequency." "That's what I'm going to do. That will light up every search and rescue coordination center from here to the coast." "That's the idea." She heard him exhale a long, controlled breath that told her more than he probably intended. "The signal will also be detected by the Bell 412 on approach. They have radio monitoring capability. They'll know something changed. They'll know the position is being actively broadcast on a federal emergency frequency." "Yes." She looked up from the device. "What do you think 4 armed contractors do when they realize the location they're approaching is actively transmitting a distress signal that multiple federal agencies are tracking in real time?" Garrett looked at her. The firelight was steady on his face, and in it she could see the particular expression of a man who has spent his professional life thinking several moves ahead and has just encountered someone thinking further. "They abort," he said. "They abort." She agreed. She turned back to the device and began working through the menu system. Main menu. 3 button presses for transmission parameters. The frequency entry field opened a blinking cursor waiting for input in a box that expected kilohertz values. She typed 406,000. The device hesitated. A prompt appeared. Frequency out of standard operating range. Confirm override. She pressed the confirmation key. A second prompt. Encryption protocol inactive at this frequency. Transmission will be unencrypted. Confirm. She pressed confirm again. The device's status light, which had been a steady amber, shifted to green. Transmitting 400 to 6.000 MHz, GPS, coordinates, active. She set it down on the table facing upward, the antenna oriented toward the door where the earth cover was thinnest, and picked up the satellite phone. Agent Pruitt. I'm here. I have just activated a SARSAT-compliant emergency beacon at my location. The device is transmitting on 406 MHz with embedded GPS. You should be receiving coordinates through NOAA ground stations within the next 60 seconds. A pause. She heard rapid keyboard clicks, a voice in the background saying something she couldn't pass. Ms. Caldwell, we are receiving a SARSAT alert at your coordinates. That is, yes, that's confirmed. A beat. How did you? It's a long story. What's the status of the private aircraft? More background noise. Then, Kalispell ATC is reporting the Bell 4. 1-2 is requesting a frequency change. They're turning. Ms. Caldwell, the aircraft is turning. They've reversed course. Nora set the phone down on the table and sat for a moment in the firelight and the warmth of the dugout she had built with her own hands and let the information settle. The mercenaries were gone. Not because federal law enforcement had outrun them, not because anyone had stopped them physically, but because she had changed the geometry of the situation. She had made their target too visible, too documented, too federally monitored to approach. She had made arriving here not just illegal, but catastrophically documented. She had given the Force somewhere to go, just like her father had taught her. She looked at Garrett. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not professional, not calculating, not any of the various forms of adversarial assessment he had been directing at her since he regained consciousness. Something plainer than all of that. Something that had the quality of a man encountering a fact that doesn't fit any of his existing categories. In 30 years of this work, he said, I have never had a target do that. I'm not a target, Nora said. I'm an engineer. His mouth moved. It might have been the beginning of a smile abandoned before it arrived. No, I suppose you're not. The next 40 minutes were the quietest stretch of time Nora could remember since she had driven east out of Seattle 9 months ago. She fed the stove. She drank coffee. She monitored Garrett's vital signs with the methodical regularity she had maintained through the night. She listened to the wind continue its slow, grudging retreat from the mountain. They spoke in those 40 minutes more directly than they had spoken at any point in the previous 12 hours. Not about the case, not about Gary, or the seed phrase, or the coalition, about smaller things. Garrett asked about the timber frame, how she had cut the joints, how she had calculated the load path through the ridge beam. He listened to her answer with the focused attention of someone genuinely interested, not performing interest. She found herself going into more detail than she had intended, explaining the logic of the design, the way she had explained engineering problems to graduate students in the single semester she had guest lectured at the University of Washington before all of this. At some point, she realized she was almost enjoying it. She noticed the moment, and the noticing made her set it aside. There would be time later to understand what it meant that the most substantive conversation she'd had in 9 months was with the man who had come to this mountain to find her. For now there was coffee and the stove, and the sound of the wind losing its argument with the cabinet range. Shortly before 8 in the morning, the wind stopped. The abrupt, almost eerie cessation of sound that follows the passage of a major storm system when the pressure gradient equalizes and the air goes suddenly absolutely still. The silence was so complete after days of constant roaring that Nora found herself on her feet before she had consciously registered why her head tilted, listening to the nothing where the storm had been. Snow was still falling. But straight down now, straight down in the dead calm air, the large, soft flakes of a storm's final act, drifting without urgency through air that was no longer fighting anything. She dialed Pruitt. He answered before the first ring completed. "Winds stopped at my location," she said. "0. Snow is light and falling straight. Ceiling looks high and clearing." "We're launching," he said. The sound of activity behind him suggested he had already been moving. 35 minutes, maybe 30. The transponder is still broadcasting. "We're tracking it. We have your exact position." A pause. "Ms. Caldwell, is there anything you need before we land?" She looked around the dugout. The fire, the plywood table, the rope still tied to the base of the central post, the 2 wool blankets in a pile on the floor where Garrett had lain through the night, the 12 words written in black Sharpie on her left forearm. "Just the attorney," she said. "I want Whitfield on the ground when you arrive. She's already in the air from Missoula. She'll be there." Nora ended the call. She set the phone down and went to the stove and put the last of the morning's wood on. She moved through the small space with the economy of someone who had learned it completely, who knew without looking where every surface was, where the light fell, where the cold came in, and where it didn't. She had been in this room for 5 days. It felt in a way she would have struggled to articulate to anyone who had not been through something similar, like the place she had been trying to reach for much longer than 5 days. Like the place that had been waiting for her at the other end of a very long transit through a marriage that turned out to be constructed around a hollow center through a federal investigation that had stripped her of everything except the knowledge she had spent a lifetime accumulating through a 9-month exile that had ended in 38 days of labor that had produced against all reasonable expectation a home. Garrett spoke from the floor. "Nora." She turned. He was looking at her with an expression that was for the first time since he had regained consciousness in her dugout, entirely unguarded. Whatever professional composure he had been maintaining had quietly set itself aside, and what looked at her now was simply a man who had been through a serious ordeal and was beginning to understand the shape of what had happened to him and what hadn't. "I would not have made it through the night without you," he said. "I know. The brief, what was authorized." He stopped, chose his words with the care of someone who had decided that precision mattered more in this moment than self-protection. "If I had found you in different circumstances, you not out here, me not injured." "I know that too," she said. She sat down on the edge of her cot and held her coffee in both hands and looked at him. "And I want you to think about that when you're recovered. Not as a confession, just as a thing worth thinking about." He held her gaze, nodded once. Small, not performative. "Daniel's clients," he said. "The 812 accounts. Are they actually going to see the money? If the federal asset recovery process works the way it's supposed to, yes. It will take time, but the funds are there, $40 million intact, recoverable with the seed phrase. The government has strong incentive to make the distribution happen correctly because it's a high-profile case with surviving victims who are watching." She paused. "That's why I called the FBI instead of handing it to your team. A private operation takes its fee first, and the actual victims are last in line. Probably get 20 cents on the dollar after expenses." Garrett was quiet. "Daniel would have said the same thing," he said finally. It cost him something to say it. She could see that. Then Daniel was good at his job. Something shifted in Garrett's face. Not collapse resolution. The face of a man who has been carrying a weight and has found somewhere at last to set it down. She heard it before she saw anything. The sound came from outside and above a deep, rhythmic percussion that was unmistakable to anyone who had ever been near one. The thudding, organized beat of a large helicopter's main rotor somewhere to the east and descending. Garrett's eyes moved to the ceiling. "That's a Sikorsky," he said. "UH-60. "Yes. Not a Bell 412. "No." Nora stood up. "Not a Bell 412. She crossed the room and put her hand on the door bar. She paused there for a moment in the amber light of the dying lantern and the growing brightness of morning filtering through the gap at the top of the doorframe. She thought about the last time she had stood at this door 5 days ago in the dark, in the roaring blizzard, with a shotgun in her hands and a stranger's voice on the other side. She thought about everything that had ever been on the other side of a door she was afraid to open. She lifted the bar. She pushed the door outward against the weight of the snow that had drifted against it, 3 feet of consolidated snowpack, dense and heavy, that gave way slowly, and then all at once, as she leaned into it with her shoulder. Cold light flooded the dugout. She raised her hand against it. The world outside was white and absolutely still and enormous. The cabinet range extended in every direction under a sky that was clearing from the west, pale blue at the horizon, deepening to a hard, ringing blue overhead. The gorge below her was invisible under snow. The logging road buried the forest on the facing slope, transformed into something architectural and clean. Every surface had been remade. Every line was new. The helicopter came over the ridge to the east at low altitude, its landing lights cutting twin beams through the cold, clear air, the sound of it filling the valley completely. A Sikorsky UH-60 olive-drab Federal Rescue configuration. The side door opened, a flight medic visible in the opening. It had found her coordinates with precision. It was exactly where it was supposed to be. She stepped out of the dugout. The snow came to her mid-thigh. She waded forward until she was clear of the entrance, until she was standing on the open slope below the buried roofline, and she raised both arms above her head. The flight medic in the door saw her and relayed the position to the pilot. The helicopter began its descent toward the flat section of the logging road below its rotor wash, blasting snow in enormous spiraling columns that caught the morning light and turned it briefly, beautifully iridescent. Behind her from inside the dugout, Garrett's voice. "Nora." She turned. He had managed to get himself propped against the doorframe. She had not heard him move, and the effort it had cost him was evident in the color of his face and the rigidity of his jaw. He was holding the frame with both hands, his splinted leg extended in front of him, his eyes on the helicopter. "Tell them I cooperated," he said. She looked at him for a moment. The man who had followed her trail for 3 months, who had come to this mountain carrying a tactical dossier and a device that called mercenaries instead of rescuers, who had bled on her floor and screamed while she set his broken bone and spent 3 nights burning with fever while she kept his temperature from crossing the line it couldn't come back from. "You cooperated," she said. The rescue team reached her in 11 minutes. 2 medics in cold weather gear moving fast and efficiently through the snow with a collapsible litter and a medical kit that made her trauma bag look like a first aid pouch. They assessed. Garrett confirmed the field reduction and splinting with the professional admiration of people who recognized competent work when they saw it, started an IV line and had him packaged and moving toward the aircraft in under 8 minutes. A third figure came up the slope behind the medics. A woman in her mid-50s, dark coat, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone not accustomed to post-blizzard terrain, but absolutely determined not to let that slow her down. Sharp face. The kind of composure that came from spending decades in federal courtrooms. She stopped in front of Nora. Looked at the dugout entrance. Looked at the slope, the buried roof, the solar panel barely visible under a thin skim of new snow. Looked at Nora. "Ms. Caldwell," she said. "I'm Whitfield." "I know," Nora said. They shook hands in the snow on the side of a mountain in Montana, with the helicopter idling below them and the cabinet range brilliant and enormous in every direction. "I've been authorized to deliver the preliminary immunity agreement verbally, pending written execution, which we can complete in Missoula within 24 hours, Whitfield said. "Full closure. No remaining federal investigative interest in Nora Caldwell related to the Pinnacle and cross-capital fraud. In exchange for complete cooperation and surrender of the cold wallet seed phrase." "Agreed," Nora said. "Do you have it?" Nora held out her left forearm. 12 words written in black Sharpie in clear block letters. Whitfield looked at them. She took a photograph with her phone. She read the words back to Nora, once confirming each one. "That's it," Nora said. "That's all of it." Whitfield looked at her with an expression that Nora could not completely read, something between professional satisfaction and something more personal, something that might in a different context have been called respect. "You should know. Whitfield said that the successful recovery of these funds will result in a federal asset recovery reward. Standard rate is 10% of recovered value distributed to the cooperating party in cases of voluntary surrender. She paused. 10% of $40 million is $4 million. Nora looked at the mountain, at the gorge below invisible under snow, at the facing slope white and clean and vast. "I know how percentages work," she said. Whitfield almost smiled. "I imagine you do." The medics were halfway to the helicopter with Garrett on the litter. One of them called up the slope. They were ready, the weather window was holding, but they didn't want to push it. "I need a minute," Nora said. Whitfield nodded and started back down the slope. Nora turned around. She stood at the entrance to the dugout and looked in. The fire in the cast-iron stove had burned down to coals, still glowing, still warm, the last of the heat radiating out through the open door into the cold mountain air. The lantern was almost out of fuel, its light thin and wavering. The plywood table, the tactical transponder sitting on it with its green status light still blinking 406.000 megahertz, still broadcasting, still telling every satellite overhead exactly where this place was. The timber frame she had built with her hands. The earth she had moved. The structure that should not have been possible on a 45-degree slope with $4,000 and one person, and the knowledge she had spent a lifetime accumulating. She had built a thing that held, not just the wood and the earth. The decision she had made on the night of October 10th, when she had opened a door in the dark to a stranger's voice, knowing it would change everything. The decision she had made at 8:14 in the evening, when she had looked at a man's compound fracture and applied everything she knew about force and leverage and mechanical advantage. The decision she had made when she set the mercenary's transponder on the table and picked up a wire stripper instead. Every one of those decisions had held. The load had passed through each of them in turn, down through the structure she had built one choice at a time, and nothing had given way. She stepped back inside for a moment. She crossed to the waterproof bin and took out the photograph of her father, the one taken in 1987. The highway overpass behind him, his hand on the concrete, squinting into the sun. She tucked it into her jacket pocket, close to her chest. Then she took the tactical transponder from the table. She looked at its green light for a moment, still transmitting, still honest in its repurposed way about exactly where it was and what it was doing. She set it back down, let it keep broadcasting, let it be found exactly as it was. She walked out of the dugout and pulled the door shut behind her. She did not latch it. She would be back. In the spring, she would come back. She would pour a proper foundation concrete engineered to the site conditions calculated to the last pound per square foot. She would hire a crew and order lumber and build the thing correctly with permits and inspections and everything that a permanent structure required. She would put in real windows, the kind that let in light without sacrificing thermal performance. She would build a deck on the south-facing slope below the entrance where the gorge view was best, where on clear mornings you could see 100 miles into Idaho. She would build something that lasted. But right now, standing outside the impossible structure she had built in 38 days with broken hands and an aching back, she understood something about herself that she had not understood before she came here. She had always known how to build things. She had known it since she was 9 years old on a bridge above the Yellowstone River, watching her father explain the path that forces take when you give them somewhere to go. She had known it through graduate school and 16 years of professional practice, through every calculation and drawing and site visit and load test. What she had not known, what the glass apartment and the careful ordered life and the catastrophic trust of a man with a hollow center had obscured, was that she could build her way out of anything. She walked down the slope, through the deep snow toward the helicopter, toward Whitfield and Agent Pruitt, and the machinery of federal law that was going to, in its slow and methodical way, do the right thing with $40 million that belonged to 812 people who deserved to have it back. The sky above the cabinet range was the hard, high blue of an October morning after a storm. The kind of blue that only exists at altitude in clean air after the weather has passed through and taken everything temporary with it. Nora Caldwell walked through it without looking back. 3 months later, she drove back up the logging road in a newer truck, The Subaru had finally surrendered somewhere outside Missoula, which seemed in retrospect like exactly the right place for it to stop. The road had been cleared by a logging operation in November and was passable now, though barely. She parked where the grade got too steep and walked the last quarter-mile through knee-deep snow, the engineering notebook under her arm, the mechanical pencil in her breast pocket. The federal asset recovery process had moved with uncharacteristic speed, aided by the high-profile nature of the case and the unusual completeness of the evidence. The seed phrase had been valid. The cold wallet had opened. $41,200,000 in converted cryptocurrency, the original $40 million plus 8 months of passive appreciation, had been seized by the DOJ's Asset Recovery Division. The distribution to the 812 Pinnacle and Cross accounts had been announced 6 weeks after Nora walked down the mountain. Full restitution penny for penny. The announcement had been covered by the same newspapers that had run her photograph under the banner, "Couple Sought in Pension Fraud." The corrections were not printed on the front page, but they were printed, and they were accurate, and they were enough. The federal asset recovery reward had been transferred to an account in Nora's name 30 days after the funds were confirmed. $4,120,000. She had not spent any of it yet except for the truck. She had plans for the rest. Garrett Voss had undergone surgery in Missoula, 4 hours of orthopedic reconstruction, followed by 3 weeks of inpatient recovery. The field reduction Nora had performed in the dugout had held perfectly, the orthopedic surgeon told him, adding that whoever had done the work clearly understood applied mechanics. Garrett had been cooperative with the federal investigation into the Pinnacle Recovery Coalition's activities. Charges were filed against 3 of the 4 coalition contractors. The 4th had turned federal witness. The coalition itself was dissolved under a court order. Nora had received one communication from Garrett 6 weeks after the mountain. A handwritten note, brief and direct on plain paper. It said, "The list had 812 names. Daniel knew 47 of them personally. They all got their money back. Thank you." He had not signed it with his name. He had drawn a small geometric figure at the bottom of the page, a triangle with a vertical line through the center, supporting a horizontal beam at the top. A simplified load diagram. The universal symbol in structural engineering for a simply supported beam. A structure carrying its load, cleanly transferring force to the ground without drama, without failure. She had folded the note and put it in the waterproof bin beside her father's photograph and the leather journal and the postcard with Gary's handwriting that she had not yet decided what to do with. She stood now at the entrance to the dugout in the cold January mountain air and looked at it. The door was sealed. The entrance drifted over, but the structure itself was intact. The earth roof was invisible under 4 feet of accumulated snowpack. She had designed it to carry that load. It was carrying it. She walked the perimeter, slowly examining the junction where the roof met the hillside, the drainage angles at the base of the front wall. The condition of the door frame and the hinges she had forged herself from bar stock in what now felt like a different life. Everything was holding. The timber frame inside was carrying 2 feet of compacted earth plus 4 feet of seasonal snow, and not one joint had shifted by a measurable amount. The mortise and tenon connections she had cut with a hand mallet in September were tighter now than they had been when she first drove the wedges, the green wood having dried and contracted around the joints and locked them into a structural hole that was stronger for the seasoning. Good joinery does that. It gets better with time. She stood at the entrance for a long moment, looking in. The stove was cold, the lantern long since empty, the cot bare. But the bones of the room were exactly as she had built them, the central post rising to the ridge beam, the geometry of the frame visible in the morning light that came through the open door and fell in clean angles across the earth floor. She pulled out the engineering notebook and uncapped the mechanical pencil. She had been drawing for 3 months. The new structure was nearly fully detailed, the concrete foundation designed to the specific soil conditions of this hillside. The framing sized and specified the window orientations calculated for passive solar gain in winter and shading in summer. The dugout would remain. She had planned it from the beginning to be integrated rather than replaced. The original excavation would become a root cellar accessible from the new structure's lower level. Its earth walls and thermal mass providing natural refrigeration year-round. She would build on top of what she had already built. She would use the foundation she had made. She found the page. She wanted the site plan showing the new structure in relation to the existing dugout. The deck she intended to cantilever over the gorge edge where the view opened up the solar array, and the proper battery bank that would replace the single marine unit she had run her headlamp and her phone charger from. She made a note in the margin about the foundation anchor bolt, spacing a detail she had been turning over for the last few days, and had now resolved to her satisfaction. She looked up. The cabinet range was enormous and still in the January light white in every direction. The gorge below filled with blue shadow. The facing slope a geometry of snow-covered pines that she had been looking at for 4 months and was not tired of. She did not think she would become tired of it. She had lived in a glass apartment overlooking Puget Sound for 8 years, and she had been by any reasonable measure content. But she had not been home. This was different from content. This was something she did not have a precise engineering term for, which was unusual for her. She stood at the entrance of the dugout she had built with a mattock and a used chainsaw, and the education her father had given her on a bridge above the Yellowstone River, and she was home, and the mountain was hers, and the cold stopped as it always had at her door. She uncapped the pencil again and began to draw. Outside, the winter held the cabinet range in its full indifferent grip. The temperature at the mountain's surface was well below zero, the kind of cold that silenced the birds and stilled the wind and pressed down on the landscape with an authority that did not negotiate. But the dugout was still standing, every joint held, every calculation proven right, every load still finding its path to the earth the way her father had taught her it would if you gave it somewhere to go. Nora Caldwell worked in the silence of the mountain she owned in the doorway of the home she had built, and she was not afraid of anything the world had left to send her.